What's going on, everyone? Ren here to talk about the brand new, albeit still in development I suppose, game Mecha BREAK by CSUN Games. Myself, along with about a dozen other content creators, were invited by the developers to participate in a pre-alpha test, and the whole experience was an absolute blast. We got to try out the game for 3 hours, where we got to do a short initial training mission, followed by some 6v6 matches, with 2 game modes and 2 maps. So I'm here to share my thoughts on the game, my initial impressions, and just talk about the experience. It is important to note that we were not allowed to collect our own footage, so all the footage you see here is provided by CSUN Games, and this video isn't sponsored by them in any way, so it's just my personal, unbiased opinion on what Mecha BREAK has to offer. Diving into the game itself, Mecha BREAK really felt like what Gundam Evolution wanted to be. It's a multiplayer-focused, third-person shooter with various mechs that fill specific roles within a team, though we'll get into the specifics of the roles and the mechs a little bit farther into the video. Our testing focused entirely on PvP with 2 game modes on 2 different maps, though judging from the info that we have so far, we at least know we're getting 6v6, 3v3, a 48-player battle royale, and potentially what looks like some multiplayer PvE, though it's possible that it's a PvP game mode with a giant central boss, which would also be awesome. When we did the testing, even though we only got to play on 2 maps, each geared towards their own specific game mode, there did look to be around 10 maps that existed at the time, even though we didn't get to touch the rest. All of us did play on Steam on PC with keyboard and mouse. Controller support didn't exist at the time, though it will in the future. I don't really have any details on, cross-play to other systems or anything like that, at least not yet. So pretty much universally among the playtesters, our initial impressions were really positive. Upon booting up the game, we're all just really impressed with the graphical detail of the game, the design of the mechs, and just that initial impact that it had. It looked really good, especially for something that was pre-alpha. Of course, the standout were the mechs, which were called Bipedal Strikers in this one. They looked great, each with their own distinct personality, something akin to like a more detailed Gundam, maybe a little bit more outrageous than something like Armored Core. Vibes similar to maybe something like Zone of Enders in some way, especially with our stealth sniper. It was easy to tell at a glance what something was going to feel like, whether it was going to be lightweight and quick, or something like the hulking Tricera that just has massive armor and 4 Gatling guns. You have a pretty good idea of what that's going to feel like. It's going to be slower, going to have huge armor, going to put out tons of bullets. Everything just visually made a lot of sense, especially after playing them. One thing I'll say is so there's pilots and then there's your Bipedal Strikers. So the pilots are on a different menu. We only had 2 to choose from. They did feel rather generic, almost kind of placeholdery, but judging from the updated versions that we see on the website, those do look vastly improved from what they were when we played, so I really do feel like they were just there as kind of a placeholder at the time. Though I do feel like one interesting thing to note here is that we were able to choose our pilots and our mech separately, and the pilots actually had stats. So you would have some that were good at ranged attacks, some that were good at melee, had higher defense, things like that. But looking at the website, it seems like each mech has kind of its own individual pilot, so I'm not sure if that's something that's going to continue into the full game where you can select your pilot and select your mech. I don't know how many pilots there's going to be, if it's just 1 per mech, or if there's more, or just really what that's going to look like. It did feel like a potential option for customization, but at the same time, maybe it makes a little bit more sense lore-wise to have their pilots tied to their mechs. I don't know. We'll see. Also probably important to note before we jump into the game itself is that we used Discord for voice chat, so we could talk to the devs and everything, but voice chat does exist inside the game, which of course will be super important considering its team-based strategy. Moving over to game modes and maps, we did get to play 2 different game modes, each with their own distinctive map. One of them was an objective-based game mode with 3 capture points, so you'd go into the capture point, take it, and then as long as your team held that capture point, you would earn points over time. You didn't actually have to stay inside of it, you just had to prevent your opponent from taking it. So upon entering the objective, there would be a countdown timer before you would take the capture point, and things like being hit while inside of it would reset that, which actually made things like snipers really useful as long-range harassers of people who were trying to capture the points. And that way it felt a little bit different from something like King of the Hill and Halo, something like that. It's also nice that you don't actually have to stay inside of them once you capture them, so you can capture them and then just move on to the next one, though you could leave a defender there if you wanted. The second game mode was a pseudo capture the flag style game where you'd have a key that spawned from one of several preset spawn points, and each team would vie to capture the key and take it back to a central launch pad, where they'd have to stay for a short amount of time to officially capture the key and earn those points. Then the key would respawn somewhere else. It does give you a little bit of a warning where the key is going to show up at, so of course everybody heads that direction and fighting ensues right before the key spawns. I think it's also important to note here that destroying enemies in both game modes does earn your team points, but it's barely anything at all compared to your objective. So for example, in the second game mode where you're capturing the key, actually scoring the key will earn you 30 points, while destroying an opponent will only land you 1. So yes, it helps, but there's a really heavy emphasis on focusing on your objectives. Also important is when you're destroyed, you do have about a 30-second respawn timer. During that time, you get a kill cam of who destroyed you. You can switch between other player perspectives and watch the actual map. So there's definitely no real boring downtime, and I think 30 seconds felt just about right, where it was very impactful for the fight for you not to be back in it. And we'll cover that a little bit later too, when I get into my critique of the game. Map-wise, we only played 2, but they did feel very balanced. They obviously were created for their specific game modes, and some roles felt way better on some maps or objectives than they did on others. Some examples being the Tricera, which is a really heavy, kind of tanky, defender-based mech, felt really good when we were capturing points, when we had to sit there and really hunker down and defend the points, but it was so slow it did next to nothing when it came to capturing the keys. It couldn't keep up with the gameplay really at all. The Luminae, on the other hand, which is a healer class, same thing. It felt great when we were on the objective. I could bounce from person to person and heal them up, but it just didn't do a whole lot when it came to capture the flag. It's a little bit faster, which is great, but we'll get into some of its weaknesses or critique on it later, but it just lacked a lot of impact on that capture the flag mode. So definitely the characters you pick, the mechs you pick, are going to play a really big role when it comes to your team comp, and they're definitely going to change depending on what game mode you're playing. That being said, each game mode and map felt like it really allowed for a variety of styles and gameplay focuses. For example, the one with the objectives had a big central objective, and then 2, kind of one on each spawn side, with a sort of ring that wrapped around, and so while everybody's running through the middle, you could definitely sneak off to the side, especially if you were playing something faster like the Falcon. You could really, instead of focusing on attacking and obtaking the objectives in these big team fights, you could definitely sneak off and take ones that were relatively unguarded. Okay, so diving into what is arguably the most important part of a mech game, the mechs themselves. I said before, they're called Bipedal Strikers in this one. Does have the maybe unfortunate acronym BS, which they are definitely aware of, but don't seem to care. So that's fine. Have fun with that. But getting right into it, each mech does fill a specific role, or sometimes multiple, within a team. You have attackers. You have really fast kind of runners for things like the key, brawlers, snipers, defenders, which could also work as a tank. You have support classes, healers. I believe there were 8 total in our testing. I did get to try all of them, though obviously not very extensively, so I didn't get to get really good with any of them, but some definitely felt better than others. Each mech also has its own strengths and weaknesses, dealing with various damage types differently, so there's ballistic, energy, melee, explosive damage, etc. And each mech has different defensive stats for each one. Each ability does different damage types depending on the actual weapons and loadout of that mech. All of which we didn't get to really experiment with too much, just given our limited play time. But I'm sure if you really had the time to memorize it in-game, it would make a massive difference. Because we did a little bit. We got to, you predicted what your opponents were going to choose mech-wise and really leaned into what worked well against it. Seemed to make a big difference the few times we really got to experiment with it. Each mech came with a predefined loadout of different weapons and abilities. It seemed like there was room for customization here, though we didn't get to see it in action. There were a few things within the menu that led me to believe that you could potentially change some of these, though we have no idea if that's actually the case. We don't know what the unlock system's like, anything like that. There's just no info on it just yet. But each character might just have a locked set of abilities, akin to something like Overwatch. So you can take a look at the website for more detailed information on each mech, and maybe I'll put out some more videos if there's interest, kind of breaking it down and what they felt like. But I did want to give you just the briefest rundown of the ones I did get to play. First up, we had the Falcon, which was this really fast attacker that could switch between a jet mode and really high-speed aerial-based combat, and then more into its bipedal mech mode. This thing made a great attacker, though it's a little bit squishy. It was great because it's probably the fastest mech we got to play, so it was great for sneaking around and taking objectives in the back. It was a great key runner, things like that. This was definitely one of the most popular options and one of the flashier options, so it makes sense. Next up was the Panther. This one wasn't really well reviewed by really anybody, I think, though I think this is the kind of mech that's going to have a really high skill cap and play very specific roles really well, but not be a kind of jack of all trades and not deal well against certain opponents. This one was, I think, the only entirely melee-based class, so you just didn't have range options. You did have a dash spear attack, but it had a relatively long charge-up time to it. You also had a shield, and then you had a laser dagger that you could switch your shield into. In my experience with it, it did really well. Once you got on top of an opponent, it was really hard to get you off. You could just dash at them with your spear, go into your sword combo, and just kind of rinse and repeat this. It dealt really well against other melee attackers, and it has this kind of overall shield that made it a really good key runner as well, because it is one of the faster mechs, and then you can put up this barrier that does great defense against ranged attacks too, so it felt really good as a key runner. It felt really good against certain mechs, but it felt really bad against other mechs. Anything that could stay away from you or that had long-ranged attacks that you just couldn't get to, you just couldn't do anything at all against. So certainly interesting. Again, they might change its kit up a little bit, with the alpha testing coming up, or it might be one that just requires a little bit more practice and a little bit more knowledge of the game to know really where you sit. I think there was promise there, so, the people who see it and are already big Panther fans, don't lose hope. I know a lot of the other content creators haven't reviewed it well. I would say there's promise, but it's going to take some work to get there. Next up on our list was the Alysnes, which is your kind of middleweight melee attacker. I think it had the highest melee attack in the game. You can see the shield on it too. I mentioned shields when talking about the Panther 2, so maybe this is a good spot just to interject and say that obviously melee attacks exist in this game. I've mentioned it a few times. They are typically combo attacks that have, maybe 3 to 5 hits to them. And there are also several mechs that have shields. So with these shields, in addition to just defending against long-range fire to some extent, you can also parry melee attacks. You can also do a sort of sword clash in this game, in that if both of you melee attack each other at the same time, your weapons will hit and you'll both bounce back some. So it kind of resets both of you. The shields are obviously better for parrying that. So I think getting really good with the shield is definitely going to be one of the kind of higher skill cap pieces of the game. But getting back to the Alysnes, it is one of the better melee attackers, has a good shield, it has a good kind of rifle for long range, it just feels very well rounded, and then when you do get defeated, all of your armor falls off, and you have this little smaller, faster striker that has a dagger and a smaller kind of machine gun rifle. My team did use these in one of our more cheeky matches, I guess you could say, where we all just chose Alysnes and then ran at our opponents to capture that objective, because every time they destroyed one of us, you would just drop your armor and still be there, and we just really kind of overwhelmed them. It seemed to work really well. Again, it does have specific weaknesses, so I think if your opponent predicted it, or if just they had the right setup to counterplay it, I don't think it's this ultimate tactic or anything like that, but it was a lot of fun, and it did seem to work really well. Next up is the Tricera, and I had a lot of fun with this guy, so he's sort of like the Bastion of this game for those familiar with Overwatch. So you could kind of plant yourself, raise up shields around you, and you had these quad Gatling guns that you could fire as well. So it was just a really high defense mech with a ton of firepower coming out of it, though it was very slow, and its range was not great. So great for taking objectives, great for just sitting there in the middle and tanking damage, for defending objectives, but in something like capturing the key, it really didn't do anything at all, because it just could not come anywhere close to keeping up with the key runners, and even sitting around the objective, it was like a missile silo rocket kind of thing, and so you could sit on one side of it and try to attack them as they came in, but they could really just kite you around the rocket, so it just didn't feel like it did anything there. But of course, that's going to be part of the strategy going into these game modes, and depending on the map, is really choosing what mechs you want to play. But overall, it's incredibly tanky, really hard to kill, and I had a great time with the Tricera. Next up is the Narukami, so this is one of your sniper options in the game. This one was really interesting in that it was a little bit floatier, a little bit lighter weight, and quicker than you might expect. But if you used your scoped rifle, you did plant yourself. It does have a lot of stealth capabilities, which is great. It has a grappling hook to get in or out of situations. So overall, felt really good. It was another popular choice, and one of two snipers that we see within the game. Next up was the Luminae, which was our kind of healer support role. This one was odd in that, much like the Tricera in the objective-based game mode, it felt really good. Well, I should say it functioned very good. So I could bounce from person to person, keep my team healed up. It seemed to make a big difference when I was supporting one of my teammates in their fight. It really kept them alive. It has these two drones that come out and either do damage over time to opponents or healing over time to your allies. So in that way, it did feel very meaningful, but again, in the Capture the Flag game mode, or the Capture the Key game mode, it really didn't do anything at all. And that one, trying to bounce around from person to person, especially while they're chasing after the key runners, and just trying to keep an eye on everything and be meaningful in the battle, it just really didn't feel like it did anything. And I think that sentiment was kind of universal among the people who did actually test out the Luminae. But again, you have to pick your mechs based on your maps, based on your game modes, and when they're good, they're good. I do have a little bit of critique on the Luminae, but we'll get into that towards the end of the video. Next up is the Welkin, and this thing was arguably my favorite mech that we had. So the Welkin has this long-range fire, it has a close-range kind of light shield, and this is a little bit different in that, of course, you can fire through it, your opponents can't fire through it, though it does do damage to it if your opponents shoot it, but it will actually lock your opponents in or out of the shield itself, which is a little bit different than I think a lot of games where you can't fire through a shield, but you can walk through it. This one you cannot move through until either it runs out or it's destroyed. It is conveniently around the same time that it takes to capture an objective point. So we actually had a match where we just chose 6 Welkins, and we would run into an objective, drop down a shield, and we would just cycle shields to keep our opponents out until we took the objective, and then we would, attack them, do our team fight, and just go and take the next one and cycle shields on top of it. The Welkin has great range options. So it's got its long-range kind of laser cannon. It has a really short-range, good melee attack. It has its barrier. It just felt really well-rounded. And when we chose all 6 of them, just 6 Welkins on that objective map, we absolutely demolished our opponents. I think the score was 1,000 to like 75. It wasn't even a close match at all. And then after that, shenanigans ensued, and they would choose 6 of something, and we would choose 6 of something. So we had a couple of matches like that as well, but it worked really, really well. Or maybe I should say it worked really, really Welkin. So in talking of choosing 6 of something, since we did that twice, that was before the pilots seemed to be locked to specific mechs, which at least judging on the website seems to be the case now. So I'm curious if they will leave the ability to choose multiple of the same mech in the game or not. I'm kind of torn on it because it feels like the type of game where you'd only be able to choose one of something. So you'd have, one Welkin, one Falcon, etc., and not a team of 6 of them, again, akin to something maybe like Overwatch or something. At the same time, there's not a massive amount of mechs just yet. I think I said, 8 or so that we got to play test. So, of course, if you only have 8, or even if you had, up to 10 or a couple more than we got to try out, a team of 6 is going to eliminate the vast majority of those, and some of the mechs just didn't feel useful in certain maps or game modes, so I'm really curious what they're going to do there. And there is actually one more striker that you see some gameplay footage of, but isn't shown on the website, which is your other sniper, the Aquila. And this one was really interesting because it played a lot differently from the Narukami, so your other sniper. Though since they don't list it and don't talk about it just yet, I'm not sure how much I can share of the Aquila, but it played a lot differently from our other sniper, and it was a good time. Oh, I just realized there is actually at least one other mech that we got to play that isn't available on the website just yet, so I don't know what all I can say about it, but it is a kind of laser beam-focused attacker. But again, I'll hold off talking too much about it for now until they release some more official information. So from all the info released so far, we do get to see that you can customize your appearance to some extent, change your colors, etc., though it doesn't appear that it has the same amount of depth as something like Armored Core 6 would. We haven't seen a ton of it so far, and it's not a system that we got to interact with in our playtesting, but there is at least a little bit of customization, which is great. The overall gameplay itself felt really smooth. Very few of us had any sort of issues. I think there was one person who crashed and jumped right back in. A few people saw some frame drops, but it was never really anything that drastically affected the gameplay. And there is a lot of stuff happening. There are a lot of mechs fighting, a ton of bullets and beams and all kinds of stuff on screen. Considering everything and considering just how good the game looked overall, it seemed to play really well and really smoothly. The maps were big, but not too large, large enough that your speed-based strikers could really use their mobility as runners or to sneak attack things, small enough that you didn't have to travel forever once you respawned. And the respawn, at least for us, did seem to be random, so you would kind of pop back onto the map, so it was very difficult to try to spawn camp somebody or something like that. The lock-on is camera and proximity based, with snipers and a few of the beam weapons being the only things that you were really able to free aim, though it is interesting that you could either use kind of non-scoped lock-on for your snipers or a scoped free aim to do even more damage. And even the free aim was interesting because if you were good at it, you could fire quite rapidly while you're free aiming and hit your opponent, but if you stayed scoped and waited, it would actually lock onto them as well. So it was a mechanic that you could pick up a sniper totally new and wait for the lock on and kind of gradually build at that skill. But like a lot of shooters, your people who are really good snipers are definitely going to stand above the other snipers because they're not going to have to sit there and wait for that lock on to happen. The movement was very fluid and very quick. Your energy does exist for boosting things like that, but it is very plentiful. Though I will say once it's down and recharging, you are definitely really open to punishment. So energy management is definitely still very important, but it is a lot more plentiful than some of the mech games out there. And of course, there's units that lean into more aerial combat versus ground combat, things like that, or that even switch between the two. So it's quite interesting from a map design and just gameplay perspective to balance all of that, but the movement felt really good. Another interesting thing to note is that staggers do exist, but not to the extent of something like Armored Core 6. There wasn't any real hard crowd control. Staggers were mostly locked to melee weapon classes, so you could generally boost out of them after being hit 2 to 3 times, assuming that they were alone and only attacking you by themselves. Of course, if you had 2 people on you, it was much easier to kind of keep you in this staggered state. We talked earlier about shields and sword clashes and stuff like that. So there is some extent of some small crowd control. Staggers do exist to give those melee weapons who have to work to get up close to you, give them a little bit of a boost and some extra damage. But nothing felt particularly bad. Nothing felt game-breaking. So only good things to say, really. I do have just a couple points of critique here at the end, one of which we already covered was the pilots feeling a little bit generic. That really does seem to be addressed. The ones on the website seem great. They're much more fleshed out than what we saw. One thing that I did notice, which is probably true of really any multiplayer game like this, was some snowballing. So many of our matches felt great, and there was a lot of back and forth, and it did feel, relatively balanced. But there were a few games, especially when we chose the 6 Welkins, where once you got rolling, you would just snowball your opponent. So your respawn timer was about 30 seconds or so. So if you can kill off, 3 to 4 people in relatively quick succession, then you can just keep them down unless they sit there and wait for their whole team to respawn. So it's just kind of something to think about. But again, it's not something that we haven't seen in game after game. I think in any multiplayer game, of course, there's going to be matches that really, you get steamrolled, they really snowball. But there were plenty of matches that felt really good too and felt very back and forth. So I don't know if it's a particular issue just yet, but I think it's something to watch out for. Might be an adjustment to the respawn timers or the respawn locations, things like that. But there was a few times where if almost everybody died in relatively quick succession, as soon as they spawned back, you'd have a few people kind of boost over and jump on you. And it was just really hard to get a foot in the door after that happened. So I had mentioned earlier that I did have kind of one specific critique on the Luminae specifically, so the healer. And it's not that it wasn't impactful to the team, but it didn't necessarily feel the best to play. It lacked any sort of real burst, be that burst healing or burst damage, and so it was really hard to help your allies if there are these really clutch moments where you needed to quickly get them back on their feet. It was a really, really gradual process. There isn't really any sort of revive mechanic or anything like that, which I think is fine. But it just didn't feel like it was having an impact. Even when you were doing good, even when you were healing your opponents and helping them win fights and stuff, it just didn't really, the feeling of gameplay wasn't great, even if it was impactful. And I think it would benefit a lot from having some sort of burst healing, burst damage, or some sort of gameplay mechanic like a lot of good supports have in other games that will really turn the tides of the battle. One of the other creators said that it's less of a healer and more of a sustainer. And I think that really hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what it feels like. You're there to keep people in the fight, but not to really turn the tides of battle. So yeah, just specific critiques from me and a few others that felt that way about the Luminae. So I am hoping that they adjust its kit a little bit. And of course, like I said earlier, maybe there's some options there to get a little bit of customization to your loadout. We just don't know yet. The other big critique, it's less of a critique, more of a concern, I guess, is the monetization aspect, and it's just that we don't know anything about it just yet. So we don't know if you're going to have to purchase the game, if it's going to be free to play, what that kind of monetization aspect of it looks like just yet. Some people have talked about them monetizing the mechs themselves. I was thinking there were options to monetize like the pilots in a sort of gacha system, because at the time when we tested it, they had individual stats, and there did seem to be a lengthier list of pilots that weren't locked to your mech. Now it seems like maybe that's shifted a little bit, so we don't really know what the monetization is like just yet. Which I think is, of course, what a lot of people have concerns about. The gameplay itself felt awesome. I just don't want it to be pay to win. And for those who either have or plan on signing up for the alpha, the forms that you fill out going into it talk a lot about monetization and options and how people feel about it, which almost leads me to believe that they're not even sure how they want to monetize the game. So I don't know if there's necessarily any kind of ill intent, if you will, but I just think that they're not entirely sure. And that just leads me into the final thoughts I've got on the game, which is that I was really pleasantly surprised. Being in pre-alpha, I expected it to be a lot rougher than it was. Everything we had felt really good. All the gameplay was great. The mechs were great. I didn't have any massive critiques, anything like that. Of course, there's a few things that need to be tweaked, but that entirely makes sense. And we do have an alpha test coming. The 3 hours that we did get to play, passed by really quickly, and pretty much everybody who was in the test wanted to keep going. Even post-test, everybody's had pretty much only good things to say. Of course, there's a couple of critiques here and there. There's concerns over the monetization and whatnot. But honestly, from what we did experience and from everything we've seen so far, I think everybody involved is just really excited for this one. Assuming the monetization isn't any kind of issue and that everything sticks to the same sort of polish that we've seen so far, I feel like the vast majority of the content creators that were involved with the test will definitely pick this one up and be playing it regularly too. I think it feels a really good niche, and of course I'm excited to see more things come into the mech genre. The kind of last thing to note here is that there is an upcoming closed alpha test, and it seems like they're getting a massive response from the people who have applied so far. So there's a lot of excitement behind this game. So there will definitely be more to come on the channel for Mecha BREAK. But that is all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.